Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Karen Haas.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here today. I always get a little nervous before I give a talk, but as my husband reminded me this morning, if I can't talk about the Lane collection at this point, this, of course, is my favorite topic. So, also, apologies to those of you who may have heard parts of this previously. I hope that the sort of composite will feel new and fresh, because I am hoping to cover sort of the entire range of the collection as opposed to just parts of it, which is what I normally do in talks. So unlike last week's talk, which is really about the museum's institutional collecting and the history of collecting here at the MFA, I get to start with a love story. So Ville and Sondra Lane, I really get choked up when I start talking about them. Ville and Sondra Lane were an amazing couple who put together, beginning in the mid-1960s, put together an amazing collection of American modernist photography that, as Kristen mentioned, is now been given to the Museum of Fine Arts, but began as a very personal undertaking between two people. Theirs was a really fantastic love story and has all the sort of, kind of fairy tale qualities that you dream of having in your own history. They met on the steps of the Metropolitan Theater here in Boston, waiting to go into an opera. She was a young, newly minted school teacher. She'd grown up in Chelsea, gone to Simmons College. She was in her 20s. And he was a much older, so he was already in his early 50s. He was a much older businessman from Lunenburg, Massachusetts. And as the line in The Graduate goes, he was in plastics. They met by chance because he had an extra season ticket to the concert, the opera that they were both waiting to go into. And so they sat together. The opera was Verdi's La Forza del Destino, the Force of Destiny. And we still have the ticket from that particular performance in the archives, I'm happy to say. So together, as I said, they formed this amazing collection of American modernist photography in a relatively short period of time, really only a couple of years between 1965 and the early 1970s. So Ville Lane, having begun as a collector of paintings, and most of you are probably familiar with the American modernist material in the American wing on the third floor, which is that whole center space is really focused on the collection that he formed before Sondra came into his life in 1962. He always liked to say that he began with marbles and baseball cards. And I think that, it sounds, maybe it's funny to say, but I think really people do realize early on, it is something that you know about yourself early on. You're either a collector or you're not. And he was an incredibly acquisitive person beginning at a very early age. He was in the plastics business, which was centered out in that part of the state, out near Fitchburg, Lunenburg, Leominster. But he was never happy as a businessman. That was not his real love. But he used it as a way to get to New York City quite regularly, to go to museums, to visit Edith Halpert's downtown gallery, which was where he bought most of the paintings that are in the collection, Dove, O'Keeffe, Stuart Davis, the great American modernists, including Charles Sheeler. He liked to talk about, and I didn't know him well, but I did get to meet him before he died, and I was hired in 1995. So I've been the Lane curator here since 2001, but I was hired in 1995 to organize his photographic estate after he passed away, and that's where I began to work on the collection. He always liked to say that he wasn't as interested in isms, ists, or ists. I can never say that, but he wasn't interested in sort of labeling things, Cubism, Impressionism, all of those things. He was really someone who talked about collecting from his gut and developing one's eye, and he liked to say, the important thing is to look preferably with your mouth closed. And the other thing so this was a great, this was a huge influence on Sondra as a young woman, watching him collect the paintings that he fell in love with and had been collecting for a number of years already. The other thing that was a huge influence on her and really stayed with her when she began collecting after he died in '95 with us is that the importance of friendships and personal relationships, and the idea that those kinds of connections, personal connections, were the glue that held a collection together. And you can imagine that that makes for a very exciting conversation around the works in the collection, because I can sit with someone, in Sondra's case, I can sit with someone who knew Charles Sheeler and who knew Georgia O'Keeffe and had a personal relationship with them. And that makes all the difference. So the Lane collection, I would argue, is really unlike any collection that I know of anywhere. It's very strange and very exciting in that it's very few different artists. So these very close relationships with a number of artists that are very, very deep and very large numbers, so that we can do things like the Charles Sheeler exhibition out in the Brown Gallery that's up now, and celebrate that material in a way that no other museum can, because we literally have that whole photographic estate. This is a photograph of Sondra and Bill Lane in Carmel, a place that they loved and went back to very regularly because of their friendship with Ansel Adams. And this was taken by Jerry Sharp, who was one of Ansel Adams's assistants and students. In November 1967, Ansel Adams wrote to Bill Lane. We have all this amazing correspondence. That's the other thing with all these artists. And he said, "It was a great day for photography when you came this way." And it really was. He was an incredibly important figure, and the two of them were incredibly important to so many artists in that, even someone as famous as Ansel Adams, I mean, how many, it's sort of hard to put ourselves back into this moment of the 60s, but how many artists could argue at that time that someone called them up and say, I want to acquire 500 works, or I want to buy 2,000 photographs. This was just unheard of. So today I really want to focus on this relationship between the two, all that Sondra learned from working with Bill, collecting the way they did together, and then the incredible luxury that I've had working with her ever since in these 20 or so years that we've been working together, to sit with her, talk to her, hear the histories of this process. These are the kinds of things that often get lost in institutions, in institutional collections. We have provenance and we document how things come into the collection, but these kinds of oral histories are often lost. So we have this great luxury of working with someone who's been so involved as a trustee, both the Lanes as trustees to the museum. The other thing about the Lanes that I think is worth noting at this moment is the idea that they created this collection partly because they had no children, they had this was their first love together. They always had this idea that it would be for a museum. It was not collected as something to, you're not going to hang 2,000 photographs in your house. They were collecting for the future, and this was an unusual way of thinking as well, and I think very exciting for us. So they were committed to the museum for many years. The collection's been housed here for many years, and my position has been endowed by Sondra Lane. So it's a beautiful, incredibly, as I say, I keep using the word luxurious, but unusual situation. The collection is particularly exciting for that reason. So it all begins with Sheeler, and as I said, that's why we have the Sheeler show up at the moment, because he is that same figure for the Lane collection that Stieglitz is for the MFA's collection. He is that sort of the trunk of our tree, that pivotal beginning figure. I realized when I did the Charles Sheeler show years ago, and again doing this show, talking to young people, he's not exactly a household name. The way I think he is here in Boston, he is very much someone that people know and love But if you do know him, you normally would know him, or many people know him better as a painter than as a photographer. He and Ville Lane became close friends because Ville was buying his paintings in the 50s and early 60s. And then when Sheeler died in 1965, as I said, his widow approached the Lanes, she was also a close friend by this time. His widow approached the Lanes and asked whether they would be willing to buy the entire holding, everything in his photo studio at the time. Sheeler was one of those artists who knew he wanted to be an artist. He knew he wanted to be, in his case, a painter at a very early age. He studied with William Merritt Chase in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, at the Pennsylvania Academy at the turn of the 20th century, and a trip to Paris in 1908, 1909 was a real turning point in his career. It was the moment that he discovered really one of the very first American artists of his day to see analytical cubism firsthand, to see Picasso and Braque paintings, and to discover Cézanne and the post-impressionists firsthand. He came back a changed person. He described it as a kind of indelible line, that moment in many artists' careers where they know there's no turning back. They really are onto something completely new. And he took up photography really only as a day job, a way to make a living, to pay his bills, while he tried to sell these first Cubist-inspired paintings that he was making. But really, unlike any artist I know, he just fell in love with photography, and photography and the camera was the new tool for his art making, really, that continued throughout his career. So when the Lanes acquired his entire estate, so everything that was in his studio, they went from being paintings collectors one day without not owning a single photograph, not really knowing anything about photography, to owning over 2,000 photographs by one person. They drove down to Sheeler's house with the famous station wagon that those of you who know about the paintings collection know that every painting they bought had to fit in the station wagon. They filled the station wagon with piles and piles of photographs and came back to Lüneburg and sat in their music room and passed these photographs back and forth between themselves and across the room. And Sondra said it was a very long process, but that they completely fell in love all over again with this artist's work in the form of his photographs. So that's why we have such a large collection of Sheeler in the museum. And this is his earliest photograph that we have in the collection. And I think you can see right off looking at it that this is someone who had absorbed the lessons of modernism, of cubism, in an incredibly strong, powerful way, very quickly, and had, in a sense, gotten Impressionism out of his system as a painter. So unlike Stieglitz and Strand and his other contemporaries, the minute he picked up the camera, he was making pictures that were more radical, more avant-garde, more abstract than anything anyone had seen. So this would have been really startling to someone like Stieglitz, who was obviously an older sort of mentor figure. So Stieglitz recognized in this early work that Sheeler was onto something really dramatic and new. One of the things, and I'm not going to go into great depth on Sheeler, I hope you'll spend some time in the exhibition, but one of the things that was challenging to express in that exhibition with just those three walls, basically, was how exciting it must have been for a young photographer like Sheeler to see Cubism and then and really be sort of knocked for a loop by this experience, and then figure out how to make his own kind of how could you make an American modernist photography? What were the ingredients that you needed to make an American version of this type of cubism? And the camera very quickly became that tool for him, as I said. What I couldn't really express very well in the exhibition, and I'm sorry about, is that I couldn't show, or I couldn't really figure out how best to do this, to show that, in fact, one of the other day jobs he had was photographing works of art. So he was photographing things like, so this is actually a Sheeler photograph of Duchamp's painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, that he was photographing the collections of his friends Louise and Walter Ahrensberg at the time. And he was excited by having seen this. This was, of course, the cause célèbre of the 1913 Armory show in New York City. And he was taking what he was learning from studying pictures like this and then photographing them and then translating that excitement and that kind of cubist geometry into the experiments that he did in this beautiful little Doylestown, this fieldstone farmhouse that he and Morton Schamberg, his studio mate in Philadelphia, were renting for the weekends, turning it into this kind of whitewashed. He whitewashed all the walls, simplified, took down all the distracting elements and photographed it as a kind of cubist sculpture so that you can hardly make out with some of these images of the staircase, for example, that I think very much relate to the painting. Whether you're looking at it from above or below, there's this incredibly, you can see that he's so excited by how the photograph takes the 3D world and turns it into a 2D surface, and in the process sort of collapses and telescopes the space into this very all these faceted forms. He also, of course, is that quintessential machine age artist that we often talk about. This is if you do know him as a photographer, this is the work that most people are familiar with. A series of photographs he made at the Rouge Plant outside of Dearborn, Michigan, for the Ford Motor Company in 1927 on the occasion of their celebration of the introduction of their new Model A Ford. He was hired by an advertising agency, so this is a commissioned job rather than something he did on his own. And he felt that this was really the great job of his life. This was a job, as he said, made to order. He was so excited to document the factory, the architecture of this huge industrial complex. This would have been the largest industrial complex of its day, of its kind. He was fascinated by the challenges of this. He was constantly looking, as he said, to find those moments like the image on the left of the crisscross conveyors, which is that iconic machine age picture, I think, that most of us know from this period. Trying to find that place to stand. He was there, believe it or not, for 6 weeks to do this job and made fewer than 40 photographs total. Many of us I know can do that in an afternoon. Sheeler worked very slowly and, as I said, was always trying to find that perfect place where the the conveyors here find that perfect X and the smokestacks seem to sit perfectly in that space. What I'm fascinated by is that this is also the moment. So he's taking, I should go back for a second and just say that he's looking for those very American forms to use to make very modern pictures. So he's looking for those vernacular architectural forms. And in the case of the exhibition, you'll see one wall is the farmhouse, one wall is the New York City skyscraper, and then the last wall are the Rouge Plant pictures, so the industrial landscape. This is also the moment where Sheeler begins to, for the very first time, use photographs as sources for his works in other media. So the photograph and the work in the other medium become closer and closer, and you begin to see him working in things like Conte crayon. This drawing is in the show, and I hope you'll all take a look at it. A lot of people have said, why did you frame that photograph differently than all the other ones? And then you get up close and you realize it's the most delicate, most refined Conte crayon drawing you can imagine. It's almost as though he breathed the crayon onto the paper. It's so fine. He, as Sheeler, being an artist who was always talking about sort of removing the artist from the image, the photograph, as you can imagine, being that perfect medium for him. The other thing that's amazing about, and part of the reason we have so many photographs in the collection by Sheeler, is that we have, because photographs become the source material for his work, so much of his work, We have many that he would consider sketches. So many pictures like these are not fine photographs. They're often not even spotted, but they are source material for his paintings. So this is two photographs that I was so excited to discover in the collection that actually, when combined, add up to a painting that's in the collection at the De Cordova Museum. These were probably made in the Midwest, but just to show you that this is the other side of Sheeler's work, the work that I didn't show in the exhibition, because honestly, he would be spinning in his grave if I had shown these sorts of prints as fine art objects. Here's one of the works in the collection we have. This is the same size as the photograph. It's a painting on plexi where he's working out the color scheme for a larger painting. He would then project the image onto the canvas and paint using this as the palette to work from. The color combinations would allow him to either scrape or wipe the paint off the surface of the plexi. And he had begun to do this on glass, and he would break the glass after he was done making this sketch on top of the photograph. So literally, he would put that piece of clear surface on top of the photograph, work out the colors, and then project the photograph onto the painting and work directly from that. This is the moment where Bill Lane comes on the scene and convinces him as a plastics manufacturer to use plexi and stop throwing away those beautiful things. And so we're excited that this is in the collection as well. So the other major figure in the Lane collection that Kristen mentioned is Edward Weston. And we have more than 2,300 photographs from by Edward Weston. And they were acquired directly from the artist's family. So again, that very close personal relationship really driving the formation of this collection. This image I'm showing you is one of my favorites, and it is the image we chose to use on the cover of the Enduring Vision book, which is the book that really summed up the collection and was the sort of precursor to the gift of the collection to the museum in 2012. We had a challenge in thinking what to put on the cover of the book. We could have put crisscross conveyors, or we could have put a more famous Weston photograph. But in this case, we chose this image because of the relationship between Karis, the subject here, Weston's second wife, and Sondra Lane, which was very warm, and she had only recently passed away at this time at the age of 95, but they had a long friendship. We also thought it was recognizable as a Weston photograph, but rare enough that it suggested the range of what the Lane collection really stood for. So that seemed to be a good way of sort of thinking, how do you talk about a collection that's so large and covers such a wide range of material? This was a period during World War II that Weston was regularly making photographs of his loved ones. His 4 sons were all in the military, and he had this deep-seated fear of losing or being separated from family members. And so I think it's a really moving and beautiful image, and we were excited to include it. Karis was so much more to Weston than simply a model or a wife or a muse. She was also the author of a number of books that they wrote together, and she was only 19 when they met. That was another thing she had in common with Sondra Lane, sort of like Georgia O'Keeffe, these much younger wives of older men who shared the joy but also the challenges of that, and have great stories. She was also his driver. I always like to point that out, that Edward Weston didn't drive. And so all those trips, she was the person who was driving and stopping the car in those perfect spots. Just to give you a sense of the Weston material, some of this will be familiar to you. We have a massive collection that really allows us to take very interesting slices from that larger whole. Some of you may remember the exhibition we did, Viva Mexico, which showed a beautiful group of, that was in 2009, the Mexican material that he made in the mid-1920s when he was there with Tina Modotti, and allowed us to show that work opposite the beautiful Mexican prints collection from our Department of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs that we've now become separate from, but still work very closely with. And I'll talk about the study room, which I'm sure Anne mentioned as well, in a minute. It also has allowed us, this Mexican material has allowed us to highlight this material, the riches of this moment from the 20s, which is really rare else in other collections, to show that off in the context of the Frida Kahlo painting on the third floor of the American wing as well. We don't think of Weston necessarily as a still life photographer until quite a bit later in his career. So it was fascinating for me when Sondra went after this work at auction. So this is something that she bought after Bill died because she just had to have it. And I kept thinking, really? Another Weston? We could do something else. But once I saw it, I realized why we really needed this. This image. It's a spectacular print, and it's really inspired me to think about maybe doing an exhibition at some point of Weston as still life photographer. We also have, of course, the great, very famous pictures. These might be the equivalent of the Side of White Barn from Sheeler. These both by Weston from his sort of most important periods, and side by side, I think, give you a sense of the kinds of things that we can do in the study room, show students work that you might know separately but might see in a whole new way if you put them side by side. You get a so much better sense of Weston's fascination with sculptural forms and the play of light across surfaces, the fact that he's using a large format camera, as was Sheeler and, of course, Ansel Adams and the other F-64 photographers. So excited by the camera-made qualities of these pictures and the sort of biomorphic forms of the vegetable in contrast to this other amazing portrait of Keras. So this is an image, this is a pairing that we regularly bring out in the study room and gives us an opportunity to talk to students about the choices that photographers make, the lighting, the fact that it really wasn't until I saw this photograph, Pepper 30 on the left, in person, that I realized that he's placed it in this funnel type, this metal funnel of some kind. All the decisions, the fact that this is a slightly rotting pepper, that bruise on it is very, very beautiful. And the kinds of things that if you only knew these things in reproduction, you'd have no sense of, I think. So it really is the study room and the fact that we have this active program of students and people studying the work in that space that really inspired, I think, the gift that had always meant to come to a museum, but ours was a place that they could see, the Lanes could see, people were regularly using and studying the work. So these things aren't just sitting in dark boxes, they're really being looked at and enjoyed. So this is one of Weston's most famous nudes from the same period, also Keras. And I show it here because I thought it would be interesting just to remind people that this is a collaboration between two people. Again, that Keras was quite involved in this. He was there at the Oceano photographing the dunes. She was sunbathing and had taken her clothes off, and it was her idea. She was rolling down the dunes, apparently. And as she said to Sondra, and I've always loved, she said, Tina and I knew when to take our clothes off. She and Tina Madati were natural with their bodies and loved to be photographed, and she enjoyed this process apparently as much as he did. I love the way the forms of her body, this brilliant sunlight, the light on the sand really create this kind of natural solarization. If you remember, Anne probably showed you the O'Keeffe's hands with the solarization of that beautiful dark outline, that kind of aura formed or created in the darkroom, here created in nature. We also have Weston's last photograph, what's believed to be his last photograph, that was made just before the Parkinson's disease that was worsening at the time in 1948 basically made it impossible for him to carry his camera any longer. And I loved looking at this first, and then this, next, and realizing that so much of his work really has a very similar, if you imagine what this would look like in the back of, on the ground glass of the large format camera, that floating figure, this would have been upside down and reversed, so very abstract, this beautiful sort of constellation of rocks, really a photograph almost of nothing, but at his beloved Point Lobos. So we're thrilled to have this very rare late picture as well. So let me show you a few things to give you a sense of then when Sondra began collecting on her own. She was surprisingly confident in her own taste in what she wanted to do. As I said, she bought a few Westons and she bought some things that really filled out the collection. She talked about the picture of Karis with her head down, the nude, as the picture that got away. That was a picture that she and Bill had wanted to buy together when they were collecting, but was not available. And so once it was available, she bought it for the museum. But I think it's interesting also to see that she was always drawn to the more romantic, soft-focused look of pictorialism. She always jokes that Bill Lane is probably somewhere spinning in his grave, thinking that she's buying these pictures that have such a manipulated handwork surface, all the things that really he was not drawn to at all. But I love that you can see the threads that tie them together. And again, these are the kinds of things we start to see in looking at the works in the study room and putting works side by side. So here on the left, a work by Anne Brigman, fellow contemporary of Weston's, friend of Weston and Adams and Cunningham, working in California, working in the Sierra Nevada, taking very similar subjects in that she's photographing the trees and the mountains, but here with these wonderfully sort of strange, hand-worked. You can see that the two nude figures of the women, one of them actually, the dress that she's wearing is almost completely hand-worked and drawn in rather than photographic. So Sondra described this as collecting fore and aft. She liked the idea of collecting before and after the modernist, American modernist material that is really the basis of Bill Lane's collection that she and he put together as a couple. That actually, going back to the last slide, gives me a chance to also say we're working on a book right now on the early Edward Weston, so his pictorialist period work from that same moment. And so hopefully next year we'll have a talk about that period, which is also one of the great riches of the collection. We also have Ansel Adams, and those of you who have been connected to the museum for a while might remember the big Ansel Adams show we did here years ago, which was drawn almost entirely from the Lane collection. Again, an embarrassment of riches. We have nearly 500 prints by Ansel Adams. He and his wife Virginia Adams were really the people who were the contact point for the Lanes, who Bill Lane revisited his friendship with Ansel Adams after Sheeler's death, and regularly began to go out to the West Coast, and it was the Ansel and Virginia Adams who introduced them to all of the West Coast photographers whose work they finally ended up collecting together. One of the things was, I mentioned Sondra was a school teacher by training. She didn't teach for many years, but it's always been very important to her. It's something she's excited by, that we can show variant views in the study room. For example, these two images of monolith, his very famous monolith face of Half Dome, which was made in 1927. We have the beautiful early Parmelian print, the very small, delicate, soft, very warm-toned print of that view, but we also have the much larger, and the difference in scale is much more dramatic than this. The slides are deceiving. So the much larger, very punchy black and white print of the same subject. This is a photograph that the negative got caught in his studio fire, and so you can see he never was able to print. Actually, it's maybe not so clear here, but he was never able to print the entire negative. So it's a wonderfully educational experience to be able to talk about these two things together. Many people would want one or the other, but what's exciting is that the Lanes really often acquired variant views of the same subject, and that makes it very nice for us. We also have the very, this is this is his side of White Barn. This is Ansel Adams's Moonrise Hernandez. We have the great pictures, the very famous pictures. This was made on a day just like today in New Mexico, looking in his rearview mirror, suddenly seeing the moon rising on one side, the sun setting on the opposite side, the setting sun capturing the buildings, but mostly the crosses in the foreground of the cemetery of this little town of Hernandez. What was amazing for us was when we had the Ansel Adams show, we had the entire family with us, his son Michael, who could recount being an 8-year-old boy in the car with his father, screaming, get the light meter, and of course not being able to find it, if you've heard this story before. And then his very technically savvy and scientific father saying, well, he just basically calculated the exposure, as he said, on the luminance of the moon and made a picture that really is one of his great and most famous images. What's fascinating for us, of course, is that his involvement with the Sierra Club and his role as a early environmental activist really, I think, resonates today, even for people who don't know his work as well as maybe some of us my age and older. This is again, an interesting aspect of his career that we have to keep in mind, and I think is very prescient today. Sondra often would buy things, and I always love this. She would say, I think we need to get that to keep it in the family. And she really thought that way. She thought about collecting as being part of a large family and being close to that family. When things came up for auction, like this beautiful folding screen, which was owned by David McAlpin's family, she was happy to acquire it for the museum, and we were thrilled to have it in our exhibition. These sorts of images, which are kind of pictures, again, of not very much. Some people, wouldn't be so interested in these. The Lanes were often drawn to these very subtle, very abstract images, and these represent a place that was very important. The Lyell Fork of the Merced River in the Sierra Nevada, that was a very important sort of home place for Ansel Adams, a place he took David McAlpin and he took Georgia O'Keeffe and all the people that, again, Sondra and Bill knew so well. I almost didn't put this in because it's just stunning how much younger I look, but this is just to say that I want to emphasize, or I want to just make the point that the other thing that's been incredible about the Lanes and the Lane collection is not only were they always thinking about their collection coming to the museum, but they always wanted it to be, and this wording is actually in the gift paperwork, that we share the collection generously with other institutions. And a real point of pride for us was that this show was not only one of our very largest, highest attended exhibitions here at the museum, but it also went on to have a very long tour, literally go around the world. We could show that very Japanese style screen in Japan, which was thrilling for her and for me. So I just wanted to make that point because I think it's really one of those things that we just sort of marvel at in this week after the Van Otterlo gift, that these things are just, that people are so generous to our museum is something that really needs repeating. When she began to collect 19th century material, no surprise, she began to think of, and Anne may have talked about this, the way we collect in our department is we think about sort of the branches of the tree. We start with the tree trunk and we find things that relate to each other so that we don't have outlier pictures that don't have any, there's no conversation or narrative between them and other things in the collection. And in this case, we had the opportunity to acquire a group of Carleton Watkins, and she does try and buy a couple pictures by an artist if she can. Obviously, buying in the large numbers that were, those were kinds of acquisitions were possible in the 60s. That's a lot less true today. When she did begin buying 19th century things, she often would buy the hero figures or the precursors that, sort of looking at that lineage of photographers. So someone like Carleton Watkins photographing Yosemite in the 1860s and 70s, someone who Ansel Adams very much credited with having inspired the look of his work and the sort of work he did. What I love about this is, of course, Carleton Watkins is popularizing Yosemite with this work, showing the public this place that otherwise was an untouched wilderness, and you already are beginning to see cart paths and the signs of human sort of intervention. And here, Ansel Adams managing to do away with all that in his much more contemporary work. The personal friendships are incredibly important, as I said, and that really can't be overstated. Some of you may remember this image in our recent Imogen Cunningham exhibition, and Cunningham really is that fourth major figure of that West Coast group of the major figures in the collection. In her case, a fellow West Coast photographer. She was the major female figure in the F-64 group, the group of large format photographers who came together in the early 1930s to sort of celebrate all that sharp focus large format photography could do. The idea of the camera made, sort of no longer trying to make it look like a drawing or print, very much celebrating what a camera could do. And then Judy Dater, in this case, the photographer who made this image, this is Imogen on the left, Judy Dater being Imogen's student. So Sondra, as I said, very aware of the history of this moment, very aware of the traditions, who was teaching whom, who was learning from whom, and this is the Imogen Cunningham she knew. This is the period in Imogen's life, very late in her career, because she had about she was actively photographing for 60 plus years. This is the person who visited them in Lunenburg and that they knew well. So when that photograph came up for sale, we knew we had to have that too. The other thing is that in the recent exhibition, I was able to show the fact that Cunningham was such a great portrait photographer. I'm not sure, most people think of her as doing those botanical still lifes like the image on the right, but we also were able to include this beautiful portrait of Frida Kahlo she made in San Francisco when she and Diego Rivera were there. He was painting the murals at the Stock Exchange in San Francisco at the time. She was a young new wife and had only begun to make her own art. I just love this portrait. And this was in the Frida Kahlo Gallery. This was a work I had to leave out of the Imogen Cunningham exhibition, and I just want to mention it quickly by saying this is an example of the kind of thing, the kind of connoisseurship that, again, we do in the study room, we do as curators quite regularly. This is a later print of a much earlier photograph, so a photograph that was taken in the 1920s, photographed in the reprinted rather in the 1970s, and acquired by the Lanes in the 1970s when they knew her. So we often will choose to show the print that was made in the 20s when we can, and we have a very strong, beautiful group of those. We're thrilled to have this print, and we love showing it. We can show it to people, and we can compare it with the other prints, but we chose not to show it in the exhibition. I wanted to show it here too, just to remind you that this is really, if you know her work, this is the work that probably would be most familiar to you. The other again, back to two pictures we've already seen, just to make the point again that as a private collector, as someone collecting for personal reasons, you can have a sense of humor, you can do this with a lot of joy and a lot of fun, and these are the kinds of things that, honestly, Sondra and I would put together and just laugh because they made us so happy to see something as beautiful as this, the height of pictorialism in California on the left, and then this wonderful tongue-in-cheek portrait where Cunningham and one of the models that many of the photographers, this was during a Yosemite workshop that Ansel Adams was running in Yosemite. This is Twinka Tebow, Wayne Tebow's, the painter's daughter, who was a popular model with the group. This is something they obviously set up, but I love that this is women photographers from California, and then moving forward to Judy Dater, of course, being Imogen's student, so moving well into the future. We also have this incredible opportunity in the Lane collection to show off things like work by Brett Weston, who was Edward Weston's son. He was the person that we acquired hundreds of the Weston prints, as I mentioned, came directly from the family, because by the time the Lanes were collecting, Edward Weston had passed away, so he died in 1958. We have one of the largest collections of Brett Weston's work and haven't yet had an opportunity to show it. Some of it spectacular, some of it, in the case on the left, made when he was only 15 years old. So work that other museums are not able to acquire, we're collecting directly, the Lanes were collecting directly from the family. The other artists we have in very large numbers, I think we have the largest institutional collection, thanks to the Lanes, of Win Bullock, another contemporary, that sort of younger generation, following in the footsteps of Weston and Adams, and very much crediting Edward Weston as having launched him into photography. He, like Ansel Adams, began as a musician, actually a singer, and only came to photography sort of midlife. But you might know Win Bullock, maybe not by this photograph, which is really my favorite work in the collection by him, because it's made at Point Lobos also, so it's sort of a tribute to Edward Weston. But you might know him as the photographer who's very famous, Let There Be Light and The Child in the Forest. Those were very famous images in the Family of Man exhibition in the 50s. When Sondra began to buy on her own, as I mentioned, she would often buy photographs that were had some connection back to the things that she and Bill had bought together, but were often kind of the sorts of things he might not have gone after. So this was the second thing. After that the Weston nude that she bought, the picture that got away, this was the second thing she bought, and it's by Johan Hagemeyer, a Dutch-born photographer who was a friend of Madati and Mather and Weston in San Francisco and in LA, who had a slightly soft-focused look to his prints, the kind of thing that Bill Lane just turned his nose up. He was not interested in, but you can see there's Sheeler in this too. If you know the painting Upper Deck, you know his deck top, shipboard views. So there's a little bit of Sheeler here. There's a little bit of pictorialism. These are the kinds of things I always joke that after you've been working together so long, it's sort of like a marriage for us too. We have a sort of shorthand with each other. We go into shows or auctions, you go into a preview of some kind, and I always try and guess what she's going to like. And this was a picture we knew that she would love for all those reasons. She also was drawn to European modernism, and you can see here that rich matte surface prints like the earlier Anne Brigman. This by the Czech photographer on the left. Dridikal, a nude from about 1930, a series of these beautiful female nudes that he did at the time for a book he was doing. And a picture that I just love that she acquired, this portrait that hopefully will remind you of some of the things that Anne showed last week, a portrait of Steichen by Heinrich Kuhn. So Austrian photographer, taken at a moment, this wonderful moment where Steichen and Stieglitz and were with Kuhn, and they were all experimenting with making autochromes, the very first experiments with color photography. They were all together at the time, taking pictures of each other. And this is exactly the sort of picture that Sondra is drawn to, and again, Bill Lane would probably not have acquired. She's also very interested in Czech photography, and I don't know if Anne mentioned last week, but Josef Szuc is a particular love of hers, and she very generously helped us acquire a group of Szucs a number of years ago. As I said, when she began to acquire 19th century work, she began to realize that you could very much, you could buy 19th century prints, major 19th century works, for the price or even less of contemporary photography. And so she really, for a period of a couple years, looked at 19th century material much more directly and seriously. And she bought this Baldus image of the Louvre, and again, we laughed when we put it next to the side of White Barn because it really had it resonated in such an interesting way. It really is just a photograph of light across a white facade, that flat, very frontal look. This was a period that Baldus had been hired commissioned by Napoleon III to document these extensions that were being built on the Louvre. And he made all sorts of images. Some of them they range from tiny details of sculpture to these much more straightforward, much larger views. And she found the one that looked like Side of White Barn. That's what I guess I'm trying to say. She really always manages, and she doesn't always realize she's doing it, but we often can see it after we look at them together, and it's really fascinating. So now I'm going to just really romp through some pictures, and hopefully you don't mind the speed. I'll answer questions at the end. I'm happy to talk further. But I just wanted to show you, again, sort of the range of the collection and the sorts of pictures. Often, she would acquire the work of an artist, and literally it might be the only picture by that photographer she would ever be interested in, and that is the case with this one. She wanted this picture not because it was by Diane Arbus, which of course thrilled me to the core. I was happy she was buying a Diane Arbus. What she wanted was this portrait of Susan Sontag. This was bought the year that Susan Sontag died. And in 2004, it was very much in her mind a tribute to that person and a portrait of someone that she admired. So sometimes it's as simple as that, and sometimes that's really, maybe that's the difference between collecting personally versus institutionally. We're going to find that balance maybe, and for her, that was really the only reason. She loved this image, and what I love about it was made as part of her magazine work, and Sondra also never seemed to mind. She never made the distinction between commissioned work, documentary work, and I think this goes back to Sheeler again, magazine work, all of those things for her. It was really about the image, her response to the image and the story and the subject, and really very little about, I got excited that this was made for Esquire magazine in 1965, a series of pictures she made of famous people and their children. This is going to be in our upcoming exhibition of family photographs. She also fell in love with the work of Arno Minkkinen. He is one of several artists in the collection who credit Ansel Adams with having inspired his work early on. He's a Finnish-born photographer who lives now in Andover, Massachusetts, and has a great international reputation, and is sadly, I think, less well-known here locally than he is maybe internationally. You see, he takes his own naked body, and he has been doing this for about 40 years, and puts himself into his pictures, sometimes camouflaged in very wonderful ways. So you see, there he is between the trees, and this is very much meant to be a kind of riff on Ansel Adams's, rows of aspen trees here with the artist between the trees. She also was excited by work often that, in a funny way, has that same kind of quality, I think, as the Arno Minkkinen. You look at it for a long time, it's a little difficult to see, to get the joke or to see what you're really understand what it is you're seeing, and that appealed to her. Minor White, being an artist who we think of as being a local person, but began his career with Ansel Adams in California. Here photographing a crack in a window and ice that becomes sort of this, figure-like form, beautiful abstraction. These are the kinds of things that really appeal to Sondra, that kind of mystery and beauty. She also, of course, loves the landscape, the American landscape here by two photographers. One, actually neither of them great, known as photographers, but John Sarkowski, the image on the left, better known as the major curator of photography for many years at MoMA. Theirs was also a personal relationship. We got to know him. She had known him for a long time, but we got to know him particularly well when he was organizing his big Ansel Adams exhibition. He was also a terrific photographer. And she became very interested in these aerial views, either the bird's eye view like the John Sarkowski on the left, or an aerial view like the William Garnett on the right, also from the 50s, where he's piloting his own little two-seater Cessna airplane and photographing a plowed field. These are the lines of a plow and that area where maybe it's turned around or somehow not plowed it yet. This beautiful abstract form that's very difficult to read otherwise. And I love the fact that, here she is, she's gone from this sort of sublime Edward Weston and Ansel Adams Western landscapes. She's interested in these rather offbeat views, but she's also then going on to collect the new topographics photographers like Nick Nixon, Joe Deal, and Frank Golke. So the aerial view and the interest in that angled view, of course, comes back in other forms, and it's something that if you've seen the Sheeler show, you know that Sheeler was experimenting with Manhattan. Here, a picture by Ilse Bing, view from the Eiffel Tower in Paris. She was a German-born photographer, European modernist, who was known for working with the Leica camera, so a small 35 millimeter camera that allowed her to make these very angled, steeply angled views and turn the pedestrians in the same way you see in Manhattan pedestrians into these ant-like figures. She was sometimes referred to as the queen of the Leica, and a photographer I was thrilled that Sondra wanted to acquire for the Lane collection, but I probably wouldn't have guessed. So there's a little subset of Paris, because Paris is a favorite city for both of us, and she has a small group, but beautiful group of images of Paris, including this image on the left by Atget, and on the right by Ville, two photographers who were photographing Paris in a very concerted way, in Ville's case in the 1860s, and during that period when Haussmann was transforming the city into the city of boulevards and lights, in this case, the city of lights, and transforming the city. He was making portraits, basically, of streets and of fixtures like this. This is an image that came from a wonderful album of photographs that became available a couple years ago. The nice thing about being a private collector, because Anne probably talked about the process that we go through in acquiring works, it's quite prolonged sometimes and very careful, and we have to discuss everything, and it has to be very seriously thought through. If you are a personal private collector, you can just go in and say, I will take that. And so when this album became available, a lot of people lined up to acquire works from it, and Sondra was very happy to get this, the Hotel de Ville image that she feels is really, for her, it was the right picture, and she was excited to get it. The image on the left is by Atget, so he was doing a similar type of documentation of Paris, only at the turn of the 20th century. In his case, often doing not only the street views, but interiors and details of buildings, staircases and metalwork, and fireplaces for architects and designers. He was describing these as documents, photo documents. So again, it's interesting to think about what these pictures were made for and how we've co-opted them, and we feature them here in the museum as works of fine art. Atget would argue that this was really just a document of a fireplace for an architect or a designer. But it's an incredibly beautiful thing, and we did find the building that it's from, which is still standing on the Ile Saint-Louis. It is a house that it turns out that Baudelaire lived in the 1840s and wrote some of his major poems. And so it's a really beautiful picture, and I was so excited. That was one that I really begged for, I have to say. I love it. She also collected still lifes, and I mentioned that with Edward Weston, and here's another. This is maybe the classic still life, Edward Weston still life. When she went more contemporary in her collecting, she would go for these very classic images like this Irving pen, which I think makes such a beautiful pair with the chambered nautilus. So a much more recent picture from the magazine work that he did for Vogue and various magazines in dye transfer, with these spectacular colors, often these beautiful popping, see again that dark outline, that aura around the subject that I think, again, reminds us of Weston. For her, she always said this reminded her of a dancing couple, too. She could see things in pictures, or she was drawn to pictures for reasons sometimes that were not obvious, and I quite love that. Here I'm showing you two more still lives. The interesting thing for me in this is that, on the one hand, a paper negative, a print, calotype, made by William Henry Fox Talbot, the inventor of the process. This from or probably early 1840s. This was reproduced in his Pencil of Nature. And then a daguerreotype, of course, which was that other invention at the same moment in France, but in this case by a very contemporary photographer, Adam Foos, of a butterfly. These are the sorts of things, the unusual choices and the sorts of things that make the collection, I think, so exciting for me. What I loved about this picture by Talbot, of course, if you collect 19th century photographs, you'd love to have a Talbot. This one was perfect for Sondra because if you look at the pencil of nature, this is a moment you have to kind of put your mind back. This is a moment where people really were trying to sort out what photographs were even going to be for. What were we going to do with them? What was the point of photography? And one of the things that it says in the pencil of nature is that if you're a collector, and you have a collection, like this collection of china, it's much easier to just photograph it than describe it in words. And so it made a perfect sense for a great collector to have this collection picture. She also, of course, loves portraits, and often the portraits have very powerful connections for her, personal connections, like the image of Barack and Michelle Obama. This was made in 1996. By a terrific photographer, Mariana Cook, who's based in New York, who was Ansel Adams's last assistant, so someone who had an Ansel Adams connection, who made this portrait for the New Yorker magazine in 1996 when Obama was trying to decide whether to go into politics or not. We have a wonderful portrait of her with Barack Obama when he ran for president. She's just, a huge fan, and so she wanted to have this portrait of them. It's a really iconic and wonderful image. And the image on the left, Harry Callahan, an artist that we have in the collection, the museum's collection, in great depth. Anne did a wonderful show a couple years ago from that material. And this is the Harry Callahan that she wanted to own, and this is because for her it made such great sense. It's Eleanor and Barbara, so the artist's wife and daughter, which two people he photographed over and over the course of his career, a kind of us against the world sensibility, I think, in this image. For Sondra, this was really all about her, in her mind, was all about her relationship with her mother, who was a single parent, and the fact that, she had grown up in very modest beginnings in Chelsea, Massachusetts. And then I always joke with Anne that this is the kind of thing that happens when I go away and I'm not with her when she makes an acquisition. And I'm thrilled that we have it, but honestly, this picture still makes me laugh when I look at it because it cannot be further from what I imagine the Lane collection is about, right? So this is Robert Heineken, someone who is really doing the opposite of that sort of fine individual print, sort of the fetish around the perfect print that we often see with the artists, the American modernists that they collected. Here's someone who is sort of, basically recycling images from advertising and from mass media and literally creating a painting, a photograph, and a piece of sculpture all in one. This is literally a 3D object in that tin is under this piece of canvas and then hand-painted on top. A lot of times, and I'm going to wrap it up now quickly, a lot of times the collecting of the photographs actually related very directly to the collecting of the paintings, which had happened before Sondra came on the scene, but meant that the relationships with the artists had lived on. So Sondra describes flying to Abiquiu, out to Ghost Ranch, New Mexico, to visit with O'Keeffe. She was a young woman. She has very vivid memories of this as a young person, and tells beautiful stories about meeting O'Keeffe and climbing up that ladder and sitting on the roof and watching the sunset. It's just amazing. Anyway, and when I first visited her house, and many of the collection objects were still on the wall there at their home, I saw this picture. I hate to tell you where it was. I think it was in the bathroom. And I said, "Who's that by? That's really interesting." She said, "Oh, it's by Georgia O'Keeffe." And I thought, Georgia O'Keeffe didn't make photographs. This can't be. And when we finally got it to the museum, we opened it up, and on the back it says, "Happy New Year to Ville Lane, 1958, Georgia O'Keeffe." And since I've discovered that she did make photographs, and some of these will be in the show that hopefully some of you will see at the Peabody Essex Museum that's coming up, Georgia O'Keeffe show, where they show some of the photographs. this house in Abiquiu, New Mexico, that she acquired basically because she talked about the love of this particular door and this beautiful wall. And she painted it more than 20 times, and 2 of these paintings are in the Lane collection. Also, beautiful relationships, I think, between things like the Edward Weston Point Lobos rock on the left and things like the Dove paintings and, in this case, pastels in the collection. You can see that same interest in form, in stylized, simplified form, either in a photograph or, in this case, in this beautiful pastel. I also wanted to just mention, again, only wanting to buy a certain work by an artist. She was drawn to Nan Goldin as a Boston photographer, someone who had studied at the museum school. She didn't want this picture by Nan Goldin. This is in our museum's collection. This will also be in our Unexpected Families exhibition. But she wanted this image on the left of Ivy in the Boston Garden, taken while Nan Goldin was a student here at the museum school. So very, very early on, not that Cibachrome, not the brilliant color picture that most collectors would go for. She was interested in this one. And what I love about it is, and this is something that was very important to Sondra, is she always wanted the collection to be a magnet for other collectors. She wanted to be able to show that the Lane collection wasn't an end in itself, that it inspired other people to give other things. And in this case, we're thrilled to have another collector with Boston connections give us the other view of the same subject made on the same day. Also, the Starn twins, an example of another pair of artists who went to the museum school, made this beautiful photograph on Gampi Japanese paper. It's a double-layered image of trees. These were twin photographers, many of you must know their work, who actually applied to the museum school as with one application and have always worked as a team since then. But it also helps explain why so often when you look at their photographs, you see the double layer. There's twinning even within the image. And this relates to a series of a commission that they did at the Ferry Street, New York subway station, if you have a chance to see it. She also, and I always love looking at this image and seeing the qualities of this image, and then look at this and think about the abstract qualities of this. When I first saw this image, I actually thought, seeing just one of them, that I was seeing somehow a tree with a moon behind it. And in fact, these are the retinas of the photographer's actual eyes. This is a sort of DNA-level portrait of this artist, Gary Schneider, South African-born photographer. And she said to me, I still remember it, she said, I think I need the photographer's eyes. And so she acquired these 2 images that are a diptych. Also, again, that same mystery, that abstraction, that quality of black and white, that I think you can see how this looks back to maybe Sheeler as well. Vera Luder, a German-born contemporary photographer who hosted us in her studio not too long ago, our friends group, made this incredible camera obscura view of New York. She's known for printing negative prints, so this is obviously a negative image, but made in a very large camera obscura, a room-sized camera. Some of these exposures, hours and sometimes days, sometimes months long. In this case, you see she's photographed Lower Manhattan before 2001, and the fact that the World Trade Center buildings were so reflective, they look like these ghostly forms, and Sondra was really drawn to that for that reason. And then finally, I just wanted to show, again, sort of antithesis of the Lane collection pictures. What do you think of when you think of Lane collection pictures? You think of small, black and white, American, kind of maybe symphonic Western landscapes. And this, when she decided to buy this picture, I was fascinated. It has many of the abstract qualities that you can now, I think, sense appeal to her. But here, English photographer, working in Sussex, making these photographs of very kind of banal landscapes, very large color images, and very unexpected, but very exciting. And finally, this is the picture we put on the back of the book, the Enduring Vision book, that if you're interested in reading about the collection and how it came together, there is an essay in there that you might find interesting. We put this on the back of the book because we talked about, my beginnings, sort of being someone who started in the field, a million years ago. I fell in love with photography through Robert Frank, and Robert Frank and the Americans was a huge influence on my early years. But Robert Frank was someone I thought I knew, and this was not the Robert Frank I knew. And she wanted to buy this photograph, and after she bought it, I learned more about it, but I have to admit, at the time, I really knew very little. But the reason we put it on the back of the book was for her, this picture that was made for Frank's first wife. This was kind of a Valentine, a series of more than 70 photographs he made of the chairs and the Tuileries in Paris. For her, it was a portrait of a couple, the person who was present and the person who was gone. And so for her, it was the perfect sort of coda, the ending to the book, that it was a way to say that she's still here, she's actively collecting, although not these days, but at the time we did the book, she was. And it really means so much to me that it had that personal connection. So I'm thrilled to have a Robert Frank, and it's very, very different from any of the Franks in the collection otherwise. So I'll just end with this and say, I hope that I've managed to express to you how enthusiastic and how lucky I feel to work on this collection. This really is a dream job to work on this wonderfully strange group of pictures. But really the treat for all of us in the department is working with Sondra. And working with Sondra over the years has been such a pleasure, creating this amazing collection with her, adding to it, building on it, and really seeing that building the collection was one thing for her, but for her, it's really all about sharing it. And so I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to show it to you today. I hope that some of you will make appointments to come to the study room and look at the actual prints there, which you're always welcome to do. She is someone who is as excited to see a group of school children as the most famous scholar looking at her collection in the study room, or in the galleries. So she is just someone I think has an amazing sort of generosity of spirit, and we feel incredibly lucky that she's given the Lane collection to the museum. And I thank you all for coming today, hearing about it. Can I answer any questions?
I have
Yeah?
one microphone, so I may have to
okay.
take a minute to get to the other
Okay.
side, but okay.
There is someone right here.
Are there other major collectors of photography who are donors, potential donors of major collectors?
I think what's interesting about the Lanes is that the collection was formed at a time when this was possible. I always say, even with the Edward Westons, for example, there isn't a single print that says more than $35 on it. This was a time where, as she says, they were collecting that stuff. People were, really didn't understand why, if you could buy things like a O'Keeffe painting, why you would buy photographs. But the thing that's fascinating about the Lanes is that they always did, even when Bill Lane was buying paintings, for example, Dove, he bought in huge numbers, as many as he could afford. He felt very strongly about sort of representing an entire career. And here was this medium that suddenly that was possible to do, that you could afford to really, as he said, I want to collect the soul of Ansel Adams. We have this wonderful letter where he says, I just want to buy everything I can. That was really a very distinct moment, and something that, of course, is not true even since Sondra's been collecting on her own in '95. It's really a very different world. So we do have a number of very active collectors of photography in the area, and of course in the United States. There are real hotbeds in San Francisco, for example, where people are collecting in huge numbers. But the Lanes are really unusual in the way they collected so deeply in so few different photographers. That was very strange and different. Any other questions I can answer?
Oh, in the back.
Good.
Hold on one sec. No, you're fine, you're fine.
We learned last week that most of the photographers did not do their own printing, and I wonder if any of these photographers that you mentioned today did do their own printing.
Yes, really all of the core figures in the Lane collection did their own printing. That was very much more common in those days. This is also, I mean, again, I always say it's so hard to put our minds back to this moment. This is a period where you would only print when you needed a print. Ansel Adams was unusual in that and is much more typical of artists today, where you would print a box of images and have an edition, and there would be you'd have some things in your cabinet. Someone like Edward Weston was printing rather only when he needed a print for an exhibition or for a sale. But there are very few photo dealers. This was a really different moment, and so people were printing partly because they couldn't afford or didn't have a workshop of people printing for them. That's been a much more recent phenomenon. And they weren't editioning their prints, and they weren't keeping track of, that's been one of the struggles with Weston, is realizing on the one hand how few prints he was making in his early years, and how incredible it is that in some cases we have, one of two or one of three or a unique print in the Lane collection is really, has really been eye-opening. But yes, the photographers from the core Lane photographers, those West Coast and Sheeler photographers, all printed their own work. Yeah. Yep.
I'll just stand up and
Yeah.
So because the Lanes acquired essentially the whole photographic estate of Sheeler, does that include the negatives?
We have some negatives, but very few. Most don't survive, sadly. A lot of that was during the nitrate negative years, and those are very flammable and aren't safe to have stored in a museum, as you can imagine. Those were long ago. Those were long ago. Had to be destroyed, sadly. But we do own some negatives, very, very few, and we do have the copyright for Sheeler. There is hardly a museum anywhere that has more than a handful of Sheeler photographs, just because, and I should have said this, many of you know that basically at that moment where he begins to work so closely, his photographs and his paintings become kind of, the same thing. They're so close. The relationship becomes so close. His paintings dealer, Edith Halpert, whom I mentioned, basically asks him to put the photography aside to sort of suppress that side of his career. And so all of those sketches, all of those kind of less perfect, less beautiful prints, that's what makes up the huge numbers of prints in the Sheeler material, and those were put aside and found in his studio after he died. But it also included things like those beautiful little stills from Manhattan that had never been exhibited during his lifetime. So it's really, and that's why, if you know the painting upstairs called View of New York by Sheeler, that very bleak view of his studio, that's meant to be a kind of self-portrait of this moment, his camera covered over and sort of tied up and quiet, and the view out the window is just this big blue sky instead of the photographs, because of course that's the same title as those photographs, right? View of New York, only now there's no view. He's being told to hide the fact that he's using photographs as a source material for his paintings because it's seen as slightly suspect at the time. We, of course, find it fascinating today, but yeah. Any other questions I can answer? Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.